let me tell you why you're here. You see, it really started when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and the rabbi and his disciples, my home, the home that I grew up in, was kind of like home base for them. It was anytime they came to town, they would stay in my house. And so for a young boy growing up, having a rabbi in my living room, a rabbi around my dinner table at night, hearing the stories that they would tell for 3.5 years of his ministry, it was amazing. Now, most nights, my mom would send me off to bed upstairs long before they were done talking. And so after I thought that she thought that I was sound asleep, I would, of course, sneak out of bed, and I would sneak to the top of the stairs and sit down at the stairwell, and I would listen to the conversations taking place in the living room down below. The conversations that the rabbi and his disciples would tell of the exciting things that had happened that day, where they'd been and what they'd experienced since the last time that they were in town. Now, when I grew up, I of course, was excited to continue the life and the teachings of the rabbi. And so I hooked up with Peter. And I spent many years traveling with Peter. In fact, I was Peter's personal assistant. Anywhere that we would go, I would take care of any needs that Peter had, but the most special times were at night. At the end of a long day, when we would find a nice soft piece of grass somewhere, and we'd lay down under the stars with our pillows behind our head, and he would say, "Mark, pull out your journal. I want to tell you a story about Jesus that I just remembered." And so I took all of these stories from my childhood and the stories of Peter that he had shared to me those many nights staring under the stars and our long journeys on the road, and I compiled them into a book. And so tonight, the reason that you're here is because you want me to tell you some of those stories. And so I'll tell you as many as I can in the time that we have. I'll tell you some that didn't make it into the book, maybe. And maybe some a little different than what you heard before. See, it all started one morning when John was in town. Now, John was a rabbi, and he was an incredible rabbi. He was a rabbi that everyone wanted to be around. And so when people heard that John was in town and he was baptizing people in the river, everyone went out to see John. And anyone who hadn't been baptized was lined up. My mom took me to the river to be baptized by John. It was an exciting moment. It was going to be a day that I would never forget. And the line must have been 200, 300, 400 people long. And all of a sudden, John stopped in the water. And he looked as a man who I'd never seen before, but there was something about him. There was a presence about him. He came walking, and he stood in the back of the line with everyone else. Well, John stopped, and he said, Jesus, no, you come to the front of the line. And Jesus kind of sheepishly said, no, I'll be fine right here. And John said, Jesus, come in the water right now. And so Jesus, kind of with a smirk on his face, came down into the water. And John introduced him to everyone. He said, everyone, this is the one that I've been telling you about. This is the one that we've been waiting for. This one here, I am not fit to baptize him. Jesus, you need to baptize me instead of me baptizing you. And Jesus kind of looked at him and gave him a little elbow and says, you're really going to deny me this, and so that all righteousness of God can be fulfilled in me? And John looked at him and kind of sheepishly said, well, I guess you're right. And then you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you next. In fact, a lot of what I'm going to tell you tonight, you're not going to believe, but I was there, I saw it, and I heard it with my own eyes. As John baptized Jesus, as he came up out of the water, the skies seemingly parted. I can't explain it to you, but the skies seemingly parted, and the Spirit of God that looked like a dove, it wasn't a dove, but it was like a dove, came down and rested itself on Jesus. And then a voice from the sky, I didn't see where it came from, but a deep, loud voice said, "This is my Son, whom I love, and I'm so proud of him." I looked up at my mom and I said, "Mom, is that going to happen when I get baptized?" And she just kind of pulled me by my shirt and said, "Son, just be quiet. I don't think that's going to happen when you get baptized." He came up out of the water and he went about. He did the things that most rabbis do. You know, most rabbis have Talmudim, a set of students, a set of disciples, 12 young boys from between the ages of 14 and 16 that they call to leave home for 3 years to go on a journey of following this rabbi, to become their disciples, to take on the teaching of the rabbi. And so Jesus went about calling his disciples, a group of teenage boys. But you see, the way that things normally worked is that if you were the best of the best of the best in the synagogue growing up, if you were the best of the best of the best in rabbinical school growing up, well, every young boy had dreams and aspirations of becoming a rabbi. Every young boy had posters of their favorite rabbi on their wall in their bedroom. Every young rabbi had their favorite rabbi's signature sandal on their feet. You would collect your favorite trading cards of your favorite rabbi. Every boy had dreams of being a rabbi when they grew up, and every mom and dad had hopes and dreams of their son one day growing up to be a rabbi. And if you were the best of the best of the best, at 14 years old, you would approach a rabbi and you would say, "Rabbi, I have studied hard. Please accept me as your student. Please accept me as your disciple." And if you were the cream of the crop, the top of your class, the rabbi would say, "I've seen your studies. I have listened to your words. You are the best of the best. Come with me." But if you weren't good enough, if you weren't smart enough, if you weren't wise enough, if you weren't the cream of the crop, if you weren't the top of the class, the rabbi and your teachers would say, "Young Talmudim, you have studied hard and you have tried your best, but you're simply not good enough. Go home. Pick up the family trade. Work for your father. Get married, have children, have a son, and raise him up in the ways of the Torah. And maybe one day he will be good enough to be chosen by a rabbi." I'll accept Jesus. You see, Jesus, instead of waiting for the students to come to him, he went out through the towns and the villages and he began to call his own Talmudim. He went to the fishers to the seashore where he saw Zebedee and a few of his boys out, and he called to his sons and he said, hey, leave everything and come and follow me. Now, my mom saw Zebedee in the market the next day and she said he was on cloud 9. He was running through the street saying, "Anyone know where my boys are? Anyone know where my boys? Have any of you seen my boys? Oh, wait, they're with a rabbi. A rabbi chose them. A rabbi came and picked my boys. A rabbi thought that my sons were good enough. You see them with me? They're not going to be here for a while. In fact, about 3 years before they come back home because a rabbi chose my boys." He picked all 12 that way. He took the 12 and he went into church for the first time in my hometown. He came into church, and while he was there teaching in the synagogue, a man that was possessed by a demon came running to him. Came running and screamed, fell at his feet and screamed at him at the top of his lungs. And said, "I know who you are, Jesus. You're the Son of the Most High God. What are you doing in this place?" And Jesus just simply looked at the man possessed by the demon. He just looked at him. He spoke a word. He said, "Keep your mouth shut and go." The man shrieked. His body convulsed. And then suddenly he was sitting there, normal. His eyes full of color, full of hope. Well, some of the religious leaders had been in the synagogue that day. They'd seen what had just taken place, and they didn't like it one bit. So they told Jesus, "You need to leave and never come back." His first time in church with his Talmudim, with his disciples, and he gets kicked out. Great way to start your ministry there, Jesus. Well, word began to spread of the things that he had done as Jesus and the disciples came back to my house. They were all sitting around the living room when one of them came in from going outside to fetch an errand. And they said, "Jesus, you're not going to believe it, but people are lined up. They're out the windows. They're out the doors. They're lined up down the streets. They're all around the house. They've heard about the things that you did in the synagogue, and they're out here to see what else you can do. They want to hear you teach. They want to get close to you." I went to the window in my room, and I looked out, and I couldn't believe the amount of people that were there. Jesus spent all the rest of the afternoon and evening as people brought their sick. They brought their hurting. They brought those that were in pain and those that were troubled and tormented. And everyone that Jesus saw, everyone that Jesus touched, everyone that the rabbi spoke to, went away healed. I went to sleep that night, not quite sure of what I just experienced that day. I mean, it's not every day that you have a rabbi and his students in your house. It's not every day that you witness the type of things that I witnessed. In fact, I'd never seen anything like that in my life, and I was pretty sure that I would never see anything like that again. The next morning, I woke up early, excited to get back to this. I ran downstairs, hoping to see Jesus asleep on the floor, maybe at the breakfast table, but he was gone. The rest of the disciples were all sitting around having breakfast, and I asked them, where's the rabbi? They began to look, and they said, "You know what, he left a long time ago before the sun even rose." Peter went to the front door, and he opened it up, and he looked outside, and already the crowds were lined up as far as you could see. He said, we've got a lot of people here. I'm going to go try to find him. And so he went out to find him. A few hours later, he came back with a solemn look on his face. He called the rest of the disciples to him and he said, I found Jesus. He wants to skip town. What do you mean he wants to skip town, they all said. The entire town is here. If he's trying to start a ministry, if he's just kicking off his 3 years of teaching, then it's a pretty good thing that he has the entire town here waiting to hear him. And he wants to skip town? What do you mean? We've waited our whole lives for this. We're something now. I had people ask me for my autograph this morning. What do you mean he wants to leave? I don't know. He just said that he wants to leave. And so I watched as Peter and the rest of the disciples packed up their things, got their backpacks ready, and they walked out the door and said, we'll see you next time we come back to town. Well, from there, Jesus led the disciples, and he went to Capernaum. Now, on the way to Capernaum, they met a man who was on the side of the road who had leprosy. Now, I don't know if you know anything about leprosy, but it is the most disgusting, nasty, vile disease that anyone could ever have. A leper is an outcast from society. Socially, spiritually, mentally, they're outcast from all of society because their skin is covered with these oozing, pussing boils. And Jesus saw the man with leprosy sitting on the side of the road, and he did something that was unthinkable in this day and age. He walked over to the man with leprosy, and he reached out his hand, and he touched him. Now, I wasn't there for this, but the disciples swear that what happened next was something that defies the laws of physics. They say that when Jesus touched the man with leprosy, that his skin began to move, that the molecules on his hands and on his arms began to move around and bubble. And the man who had once been unclean, untouchable, unapproachable, was now suddenly walking around in short sleeves. His skin completely new. His skin completely healed. Completely done. All of his ailments, all of his hurt. A few days later, Jesus and the disciples came back into town. They came into my house, and when word got around quickly within the hour, people were lined up. This time, they didn't even bother to respect our home. They were coming in the door, lining up everywhere, filling in on the seats, standing on the stairway. I went to the top so that I could try to at least maybe get some bit of peace and quiet in my house. People were sitting in the windows. They were lined up for as far as you could see. Some of the religious leaders of our day, some of my heroes, pushed their way through because they wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Jesus began to teach people. He stood up. He stood up on one of our chairs because the crowds were so big, and he said, everyone, if you would just sit down, I'll talk to you for a few minutes. It was about that time from upstairs where I was standing that I could hear a creaking on the ceiling above me. I could hear something moving, and I thought, oh no, people are on the ceiling so much that it's not strong enough to hold it, when suddenly pieces begin to fall through. They begin to fall down on top of me and down to the floor below. I thought this was going to be a big mess, that this whole thing is going to give way. And suddenly I looked, and a saw was coming through, and it was cutting a hole in the ceiling. When I looked, and there were 4 men that were lowering down a friend of theirs on a mat down to Jesus below. I watched in awe as I watched this man on this mat come down through my roof, down to Jesus below. One of the men looking through our new skylight yelled down at Jesus, Rabbi, this is our friend. He hasn't been able to walk since the moment he was born. Think you could do something about that? Jesus smiled. He stepped down off my dining room table. He walked over to the man. He said, son, look up at me. Pretty incredible friends you've got, don't you? You know, this took a lot of faith to do this. Because of your faith, your sins are all forgiven. Well, at that, the religious leaders that were in the room, they went crazy. They stood up, they slammed their fist down on the table and says, your sins are forgiven? Who do you think you are, God? Who can tell someone that their sins are forgiven? Arrest this man, get rid of him. And Jesus stopped him in their tracks. He said, oh, okay. Let me ask you this. What's easier to do? For me to tell this man his sins are forgiven, or to tell this man who hasn't been able to walk from the moment that he was born to get up and walk? And they kind of laughed and said, really funny. Of course, it's easier to tell him that his sins are forgiven. And Jesus looked right at the religious leaders and said, okay, well then to tell you that I am who I say that I am, to show you that I am who I say that I am, buddy, take my hand. And he reached out his hand. And as the paralyzed man grabbed his hand, strength came back into his ankles. You could see his knees strengthen, his thighs widen, and he stood up on his own legs for the first time in his life. Jesus looked at those religious leaders and said, "Thank you." The man walked right out of the door. The crowd gasped. The religious leaders followed right out after him. You know, they didn't like Jesus very much. In fact, Jesus and these guys had a little thing going that would go on for all of his life. They really didn't get along very well. They were always upset with Jesus about something, about him and the disciples not fasting when they were supposed to be fasting, or picking grain on the Sabbath and disrespecting the Sabbath holidays. There was always something that these guys were trying to get at Jesus about, always something that they were unhappy about. And it spread. You see, the religious leaders, well, they were our pastors. They were the ones that we admired, that we looked up to. And so with them not on Jesus' side, he began to get a bad rap amongst some people. In fact, one time, while Jesus was at my house, one of the disciples came to the door. And they said, "Jesus, again, I know that there are so many people here that you can't even do anything, but I think you might want to hear about this one." And Jesus said, "Can you just give me a minute? I'm trying to eat dinner." He said, "No, Jesus, your mom and your brothers are outside. In fact, she's pretty upset that you've upset some of the Pharisees. She's come to take you home." Well, Jesus looked right at his buddy and he said, "Who are my mother and my brothers? Look around me, everyone that you see here. Everyone who has given their life to my Father is my mother and my brother and my sister." That Jesus, he could seemingly take any everyday object and turn it into an object lesson. He would be walking through town and he would see something and he'd begin to teach about it. One day as we were walking through town on some errands, I had a bag of sunflower seeds and he grabbed the sunflower seeds from me and he popped them in his mouth. And I was kind of giving him a hard time about taking my seeds. And he said, "You know, the kingdom of heaven is a lot like a sunflower seed. In fact, you know, there's a lot that you can learn from the seeds, Mark. You know, the word of God is a lot like a sunflower seed. And you've got a farmer who goes around and he sows seeds and he throws some out, and some lands on the rocky ground, and some lands among the thorns, and some lands among the weeds, and some lands on good soil. And you know, it's only the seed that lands among the good soil that digs into the nourishment and grows and becomes ripe and becomes fruitful." He says, "You know, it's like a mustard seed. It's the smallest of the seeds when you first get it, but when you plant it, it turns into the largest of all the garden plants." Jesus did some incredible things. One time he left our place and he had decided that it was time for he and the disciples to go over to the region of Decapolis. Now, Decapolis is this region of 10 cities. You had to cross the Sea of Galilee to get there. It was about a 10-mile journey by boat across the Sea of Galilee. They struck out at night, wanting to avoid the crowds waiting on either side. So Jesus and the disciples got into the boat, they pushed off, and they headed across the Sea of Galilee. Now, you've got to understand that most of these men in the boat were sailors. Most of these men had grew up on the waters of the Sea of Galilee. They knew the sea backwards and forwards. Well, it had been a long day that Jesus had been teaching. He'd been working with people. He'd been touching. He'd been healing. He'd been speaking. And so Jesus laid down in the boat, and he grabbed a pillow. He wadded up some blankets and some towels and some coats, and he just laid down to take a nap. Well, they got about halfway into the Sea of Galilee in the middle of the night, and the sun was shining down, and the sea was just as calm as glass, when just as quick as they had set out, a storm came in. It came in fast, and it came in hard. There was thunder and there was lightning, and the rain began to pour, and the winds began to pick up so intensely that the waves were coming in the boat and were crashing over on top of the disciples into the boat, to where these men who had grown up on the sea were panicking, fearful for their lives. They tried everything that they could do to right the boat. They tried turning it around and facing into the waves. They tried going with the waves back. They tried paddling. They tried letting it rest. They tried dropping the sails and letting it go. They tried everything that they knew to do to save the ship, and yet nothing was working. They were taking on water too much. They were bailing with everything that they could. Every spare cup, every spare bottle, their hands bailing water, fearful that this was how their lives were going to end. Now, you might think that this was just a regular storm, but again, you've got to understand, these men grew up on the sea. This storm was unlike anything that they had ever faced or anything that anyone had ever faced. They grew up hearing the storms of the great storms of past. Their father telling them the storm of 4 BC. The storm of 4 BC that most people didn't live through. And then they had great-grandfather who sat on the porch, and only every once in a while he would rock in his chair and say, the storm of 4 BC. Storm of 4 BC. That storm had nothing on the storm of 12 BC. Let me tell you about the storm of 12 BC. We came out in the morning. The sky was still dark, even though it was 9 a.m. We looked, and there were no boats in the sea, only pieces of wood all over the shore. There were no bodies to be found, only pieces of clothes scattered all over. 4 BC. 4 BC was a tropical rain compared to 12 BC. And that was nothing compared to what the disciples were facing in the shore in the middle of the Sea of Galilee on this night. And finally, in a last gasp effort, they look down and they see Jesus still sleeping in the boat through the storm. And as it feels like the boat is about to shatter into a million pieces, Peter runs over, kicks Jesus in the side, and as Jesus wakes up and looks up at him, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, he screams at him, "Rabbi, get up! Look at this storm! Don't you care that we're all going to die? We're all going to drown! Get up and do something!" Jesus stood up in that boat. He stretched a little bit, cracked his neck. He looked at Peter and he said, "You shut up." And then he looked at the storms and he said, "And you be still." And immediately the sea turned to glass. Immediately the rain stopped. The clouds went away and the moon shone bright. The wind died to just a cool summer breeze. The disciples sitting stunned, more scared of what they just witnessed than they were of the storm. Water still dripping through their fingers as they stood there looking absolutely terrified. And Jesus looked at each and every one of them in the boat, and he said, "Are you happy now? What were you so afraid of? I'm going back to sleep. We have about another 2 hours before we reach the shore. If anyone wakes me up again, you will swim the rest of the way to Decapolis." No one said another word. The only thing you could hear the rest of the journey was the sound of the oars slapping on the water, until they got close enough to where they could see the outline of Decapolis, to where they could see the outline of the shore. And then up in the limestone cliffs of Gerasenes, the place where the boat was getting ready to land, they could see a shadow moving amongst the stones. And they heard a sound unlike anything that any of them have ever heard before, a sound that made every fiber of hair on their body stand on end, a sound that was as terrifying as any nightmare that they'd ever had. And as they looked, trying to figure out where the sound had come from, they followed the shadow as it began to dart back and forth among the limestone cliffs of Gerasenes, running down, seemingly coming right for them down the cliffs and onto the seashore. They began backing up into the boat, paddling backwards, wondering if they could go back to the storm, because anything seemed better than what was screaming towards them on the seashore. Well, Jesus got out of the boat, and only Jesus got out of the boat. And there a man possessed by demons came running towards him, naked, completely bare of any clothes, chains dangling from his wrists and from his ankles. locks and clasps around his neck and his waist, where for years the people of the town had tried to subdue him and tie him up and chain him up amongst the graves and the cliffs of Gerasene. He would sit at night, hoping that the farmers or the pigs, it was a pig village, would go to sleep, and he could sneak amongst the tombs and find a pig that he could grab and snatch for his dinner that evening. He would sit amongst the limestone, and he would find pieces of stone that he could do, and he would drag the limestone across his chest, letting blood pour forth. It was the only thing that he could do to release the tension, the anger, the fear, and the pain that he felt socially and physically and emotionally and spiritually trapped up inside of his body. And as he was dragging a sharp piece of limestone across his chest, he heard the sound of the boat. And he looked and he saw it amongst the fog of the sea coming into shore. So he dropped the stone. He screamed down the mountainside quickly to make his way to shore, and there he saw him stepping out of the boat and walking across the sand. He ran up to him and he fell at his feet, knowing exactly who he was. He said, "Jesus, what do you want with me, Son of the Most High God? Swear to your God that you won't torture us." Well, Jesus looked at the man and he said, "Who are you? Tell me your name." The demon-possessed man, not looking him in the eyes, just sort of twitching and fidgeting around, said, "Our name is Legion, for we are many." Now, Peter tells me that sitting in the boat, they overheard the conversation, and they were sitting there saying, I only see one. I only see one man and one Jesus. What's with all the we? One and one. One and one. And the man possessed by the demons said, "Don't send us out of this place. Instead, send us into the herd of pigs." You see, right next by was a herd of pigs, thousands of pigs. Jesus gave them permission. And with a shudder and a shake, the demons came out of the man and went into the pigs, and something happened with the pigs as they began to squeal and scream and bounce and run, and they all, 2,000 pigs at one time, ran down the side of the cliff, off of the mountain, and down into the sea below, right on top of the disciples who were still sitting in the boat, thinking that they were safe in the sea, away from the demon-possessed man. What a night. You go from a storm to a demon-possessed man, and now you look up only to see 2,000 pigs falling down on top of you. Should have gotten out of the boat, guys. The pig farmer sitting nearby, terrified at what they'd just seen, ran off into the city streets. As their sandals slapped along the cobblestone, they went through, slapping on every door that they could find, knocking on every shutter. As lanterns began to come on inside the windows and inside the homes, people began to peek their heads out and say, "What's happening? What's going on?" And the pigs, you've got to come see the pigs. He got the pigs. Okay. Hold on. Did he get a pig again? No. He got 2 pigs tonight? No, just come. The pigs. Okay, what happened? The pigs, the pigs, they're all gone. What do you mean the pigs? They're just come on. And so one by one they went through town, getting together a mob of people. With lanterns and pitchforks, they made their way down the cobblestone streets of town, down through the alleyway, through the pathway that led down to the seashore. And it said when the entire mob got there, they looked and they saw Jesus and the man who had been possessed by the demons having a conversation. Now, Peter says that the man was clothed and sitting there in his right mind. That Jesus, the rabbi, not only healed the man from his spiritual torment, but in his nakedness took the clothes off of his own back and put them on the man. The people came and they saw him there. This man who had terrorized them for years. This man who had caused them so much pain and so much hurt and so much frustration, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And immediately they looked at Jesus and they said, "You, get out of here now." Well, Jesus turned around and he started to get back into the boat with the disciples. The man who had been possessed by the demons came and started to get back into the boat as well. But Jesus physically took the man by his shoulders and he grabbed him and he said, "No, you can't come." The man said, "But I have to come with you. These people don't like me. These people don't want me. They've chained me, they've beat me, they've tortured me for years. They don't want me here." And Jesus said, "But they don't want me here either. And this is your home. They can't send you away. So you have to go back and tell every single one of them about what I've done for you." Jesus and the disciples got back into the boat. They turned and began to head right back across the Sea of Galilee, which they just crossed. Not a word was said going back across either. You could hear nothing again but the sound of the oars slapping on the water. As the sun began to come up on the shore, you could begin to see the heat rising on the sand. And as the waves of heat on the sand, as they were coming closer and closer to shore, gave way, it almost gave the impression as if there were people already there lined up. And in fact, the closer that they got to shore on the boat, the more that the heat waves began to give way, and you could see that not only were there people, but there was already swarms of people, thousands upon thousands of people lined up, waiting to be there, waiting to meet Jesus as he got off of the boat, making his way back. Amongst those people, me and my mom. When he got there, it was like a carnival-like atmosphere. People had set up shop all over the place selling t-shirts that said, "Jesus is my homeboy." Everyone had the latest edition of the Jesus trading card. People had magic vials of Jesus spit because rumor had it that he could just simply spit in someone's eyes and the blind could see again. Everyone was trying to make a profit off of this man. Everyone was there trying to get their place in line. Everyone was lined up because they wanted a story to tell. They wanted to see Jesus in action. They wanted to see the rabbi move. He'd been the front page, the headline of the newspaper every day for the last several months, and they wanted to be witness to their own story. Jesus began to make his way through the crowd, touching people, healing people, talking to people, when all of a sudden there was a gasp among the crowd. Everyone stopped and froze, and the crowd began to part ways, and there, coming with an urgency about him, with two of his bodyguards on either side, was Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Jairus, the synagogue ruler, the highest-ranking government official in our city, the highest-ranking religious official in our city. In fact, the one who was the point person of trying to get rid of Jesus, and now as soon as Jesus comes back, he's coming with two of his bodyguards to go and confront Jesus. This was going to be an epic battle, a religious showdown that was going to take place right here on the seashore, and we were all going to be witness to it. Oh, this was going to be good. We were going to get our story. This one was going to be a battle for the ages between Jesus and Jairus. But as Jairus got closer to Jesus, you could tell that there was something about his face that didn't hold any strength. There was something in his face that you could tell that he wasn't looking for a battle. Something in his eyes that said he wasn't looking for a war. And as the crowd parted and Jairus came through, he came and just like the demon-possessed man, fell on his knees before Jesus, with tears pouring down his face. He looked up and he said, Rabbi, I know all of the hurt that I've caused you. Rabbi, I know all of the pain that I have caused you. Rabbi, I know that I have caused damage to you and your reputation and your ministry. And Rabbi, I know that you should have nothing to do with me, but Rabbi, she's my girl. Rabbi, she's my only daughter, and she's only 12 years old, and I've done everything that I could do. I've done everything that my power and my prestige and my money would do. I've spent every dime that I have on every doctor that I could afford, and nothing's worked. And Jesus, I know that I don't deserve to be here before you, but I've seen the things that you can do. And Jesus, she's my girl. And so please, will you come and heal her? I'm begging you. Well, how are you going to say no to the synagogue ruler and his 12-year-old dying daughter? Of course Jesus had to do this one. So he grabbed Jairus by the hand, he lifted him up, and he said, let's go see your girl. Well, there was a buzz amongst the crowd now, because not only were we going to get a story, not only were we going to have a Jesus story to tell our grandkids, but this was going to be the biggest and the best story of all. Calming a storm, yeah, that's cool. Healing a demon-possessed man, yeah, that's great. But a 12-year-old little girl, the synagogue ruler's daughter, oh, there was a bounce in all of our steps as we were following the parade route. People with flutes and bands were playing as we were on the way, going to save the girl, going to save the girl. And everyone was singing and chanting, and there was an excitement and an energy as we walked, must have been walking for miles and miles, when all of a sudden Jesus stopped. Who touched me? Somebody touched me. Well, everyone began to kind of look around, kind of startled, and Peter went up to Jesus and said, "What do you mean, who touched you, Jesus? There's about 15 people touching you right now. In fact, my hand's in your pocket right now. Sorry about that. How can you ask who touched you?" Jairus is standing over on the side looking at his watch saying, "You better hurry up, buddy. What do you mean? We don't have time for this." She says, "Somebody touched me. I felt power leave through me." And there, just a few yards away, she stood cowering amongst the cobblestone and amongst the crowds. You see, for 12 years she'd been subject to bleeding. And the customs of the day said that if you were a woman and you were on your ceremonial bleeding, your monthly cycle, that you were unclean. Not only were you unclean physically, but you were unclean socially, you were unclean spiritually, you were unclean mentally. And so for 12 years, this woman had been an outcast from anyone and everything that she'd known. For 12 years, she had to watch from a distance as her son grew up, because for 12 years, she wasn't allowed to go in her home. For 12 years, she wasn't allowed to feel the warmth of her son in her arms. For 12 years, she couldn't feel the touch of her husband's hand. For 12 years, she couldn't go to her favorite coffee shop. For 12 years, she couldn't sit in the park and feed the birds on the bench, because for 12 years, she had socially, mentally, physically, and spiritually been an outcast from society. For 12 years, she hadn't been allowed to go into any public place. She had to live on the outskirts of the city, because anything that she touched and anyone that she touched, she would make unclean. She had spent every dime that she had on all kinds of quack doctors, the pain that they had put her through physically and emotionally, and yet none of it worked. She'd given up hope of ever being able to hold her son again. She'd given up hope of ever being able to love her husband again. She'd given up hope of ever being able to sit in a restaurant and have a meal with her friends. This was her life. Until she heard about a rabbi named Jesus, who was doing things that no one could explain. And she thought, I can't touch anyone, but if I can wear a robe that has a hood on it and I can get close enough to him, maybe if I can just tell him what I've been going through, maybe if I can just tell him what I've been suffering for the last 12 years, maybe he can heal me. Maybe I can finally go to one of my son's soccer games. Maybe I can finally sit and have a glass of coffee, a cup of coffee with my husband in the morning before he goes off to work. Maybe this Rabbi Jesus can finally heal me. And so with a hood over her head, hiding her face from the crowd, she stood there, waiting patiently in line as one by one people went up to see the rabbi, and she was next in line when the hush went over the crowd and they began to part as Jairus came walking forward. And as Jesus went walking away with the synagogue ruler, she saw her chance at freedom. She saw her last hope of being healed walk away with him. How do you compete with a 12-year-old girl? How do you compete with the synagogue ruler's daughter? Yeah, what I've lived with for the last 12 years has been absolutely horrible. But there's no way that you stop it for that. And as she was ready to walk back, to give up, a thought came into her mind. She knew the back alleyways of the city better than anyone. It's where she'd had to live for the last 12 years. If she could make it to the alley of Cumberland, she could cut down 3rd Street, back behind where the dumpsters keep and where all the rats live. She could go past the old mill and the grocery store down there and cut down through 14th Street. And if she could make it there in time, then she knew that she could get through the alleyway and look, and she could cut them off at the pass because they were coming down the main road of town. And if she could do that, then she could get there. And maybe she could put the hood back up, and if she could get through the crowd, she could simply touch the rabbi, and she knew she would be healed. This just might work. And so she hiked up her skirt a little bit, and she began to run down Cumberland, down 3rd, across 14th, and she peeked her head around the corner, and she saw that it had worked. She was ahead of the Jesus parade. She pulled the hood up over her head, and she crawled through the crowd. She worked their way through until she was close enough to see Jesus, and she reached out with her hand, and she just touched just the very, very bottom of his robe. And as soon as she touched his robe, she could feel it. 12 years. 12 years of hurt. 12 years of pain. 12 years of isolation immediately disappeared. She'd been healed. She was turning and walking away from the crowd, ready to go back to her life, when she heard the words, "Who touched me?" She froze. Surely he's not talking about me. Hundreds of people are touching him. Somebody touched me. Don't be looking at 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 me. Oh, he's looking at me. She turned and she fell at his feet. She grabbed him by the robe and she began to plead with him. "Jesus, I'm so sorry. Jesus, you don't understand. It's been 12 years since I've seen my boy. Jesus, you don't understand. It's been 12 years since I've held my husband. Jesus, you don't understand. I used to go into the little coffee shop and have the donut and the coffee every morning, and it's been 12 years since I've been able to sit in the park and I've been able to feed the birds. I used to love to take the leftover scraps of my donut and feed the birds every morning. And Jesus, it's been 12 years, and I've tried everything, and you don't understand the pain. You don't understand the hurt. Jesus." And Jesus cut her off. And the first words out of his mouth, the first words that she heard, I think were probably the most powerful words that she'd ever heard in her life. As Jesus got down on his knee with the woman, he lifted her by the chin. He looked her in the eyes. "Daughter. Daughter. Daughter. Your faith has healed you." Now in front of all of these people, hear that you are clean. No one has anything on you now. Go back to your boy. Go back to your husband. Go grab your donut and go sit in the park and feed the birds. Well, Jairus is sitting over there looking at his watch saying, can we please? Okay, she's healed. She's fine. That's great. My little girl, 12 years old, synagogue ruler's daughter. You remember I have some clout here. Can we please get going? And Jesus is like, oh yeah, I forgot. And so they began to start their way back up again. And just as they were picking up steam, some of Jairus' men came with a look on their face. They held up their hands. They came to Jairus and they said, Jairus, it's too late. She's gone. Leave the rabbi alone. Jairus turned around and he looked into the eyes of Jesus. His lip began to quiver and his eyes began to fill with tears. Jesus stopped him and he said, Jairus, I want you to listen to me right now and I want you to hear me very clearly. Right now, you're about to make the single most important decision of your life. Right now, right in this moment, you can choose to believe them and you can choose to believe everything rational about science and about life. And you can go home with them right now and you can bury your little girl and you can mourn for the rest of your life at the loss of your daughter. Or you can choose to wipe those tears from your eyes. You can take me with you and let's go raise that little girl from the dead. Jerry stood up. He wiped the tears from his eyes. He said, Rabbi, let's go. The closer and closer that we got to the house, you could hear the sounds of the professional mourners wailing. You could hear the sounds of the flute players as they were doing their ceremonial baptism of the body, cleansing of the house and the space around in preparation for the burial. Jesus took Jairus, Peter, James, and John and went inside the home. Jairus led the way into the back room. When they opened the door, the mother, Jairus' wife, was sitting there with the lifeless body of their 12-year-old little girl on her bed. She turned and she looked at her husband who had been gone, and she looked at him and said, "You're too late. You said that he would get here. You said that he could heal her. And now she's dead. Our little girl's gone." And she ran to her husband and she began to pour her face into his chest and beat on his shoulders. Jairus grabbed his wife and held her tightly as her tears filled his clothes. He began to weep and sob uncontrollably, leaning his back against the wall. Jesus broke away from them, walked over to the lifeless body of the 12-year-old little girl laying on the bed. He looks down upon her. He reached out and grabbed her by the hand. He said, "Talitha kahum," little girl, wake up. And finally, in one big gasp of air, her chest rose and fell. She sprang up in bed, and her bright brown eyes sprung open. Her mother, hearing the sounds of a familiar voice of her daughter, looked up from her husband's chest and saw her daughter, her 12-year-old girl, sitting there, alive, well, smiling with Jesus. Jesus turned around and looked at Jairus and said, "You know what? I bet she's pretty hungry. Why don't you go order a pizza?" They all walked outside holding hands together. People began to scream. People began to shout, "She was dead! She's a ghost!" Jesus raised his hands and calmed them down. He said, "You guys don't know what you're talking about. She was simply just taking a nap. She was simply just sleeping." Well, Jesus had them now. Everything that these people had seen up to this point, the healing of the bleeding woman, the healing of the little girl, the calming of the storms, the teachings on the seeds, the paralyzed man coming through the ceiling, Jesus had them now. In fact, so much so that he went to the outskirts of town, down by the seashore. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people came out to hear him teach. He taught day after day after day, until finally at the end of the third day, one of the disciples came up to him and said, "Jesus, listen, here's the deal. I know that you've been teaching all day, and these thousands upon thousands of people have been here, but anything that they've come with, any food that they've brought, they ran out of 24 hours ago. That sound that you hear, it's not thunder, it's their stomachs. Jesus, I think we better send them away. Otherwise, it's going to be the world's largest mass murder because they're all going to starve to death, and I don't think you want that on your ministry resume." Jesus looked at them and said, "They're hungry, huh? Well, let's feed them." Peter said, "No, I don't think you understand, Jesus. They don't have anything left. We can't feed them. The food's all gone." "Well, then you feed them." "No, Jesus, you don't understand. Here's the thing. There's like 20,000 of them, and we don't have any food. You want us to feed them? What would you like us to do that with? There's no Taco Bell within like miles. We're in the middle of nowhere. How much food do we have?" They came over to me. You see, my mom was smart enough, and she knew that Jesus liked to talk, and so she packed an extra lunch. And so I had my favorite rabbi's lunchbox there, all packed soundly, with a few little sardines left and a few little rolls. And Peter walked up to me and said, "Hey, Mark, you got any food left there?" "Sure." "Is Jesus hungry?" I gave him my lunch. I watched as Peter took my lunchbox over to Jesus, and he said, "Hey, Mark had this." Jesus said, "That's great." He prayed over it. He said, "Now start passing it to people. Feed them all." Peter walked over to the crowd. He kind of stood up on a bench, and he said, "Okay, so here's the deal. I know that we've been here for 3 days, and I know that you all are hungry. I hear that you're hungry. I've got a little bit of food here. Who wants to eat?" 20,000 hands went up. Peter looked down, and he said, who's like really hungry? I mean, who's like already passed out hungry?" That's a lot of you. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Just just take a little bite, okay? Just a little bite. There's just pass it around, and you here, just take a little bite. You done? Oh, you've got more, okay? Looks like we've got a little bit more here. So why don't you just a little bit, okay? You've got some more. Oh, you didn't eat it all, okay? Who else? You here? You okay? A fish? Yeah, I've still got one. I've still got. Yeah, there. Here you go. An hour later, everyone had eaten. Everyone was so full they were rolling out of that place. We went around and we picked up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. How do you do it? I don't know. But I got to tell you, that was the best fish that I've ever had in my life. I don't know how he did these things. All I know is that he did them. At the end of that, you could tell Jesus was pretty worn out. He sent the disciples in the boat, told them to go on ahead of him, and he'd catch up with them later. He went up on the hillside to pray and be alone with God. When he got up to the top of the hill and he was sitting there praying, he was looking out on the waters and he saw the disciples out in the middle of the water. Another storm had come up. It wasn't anything like the one before, but still the disciples were really having a really hard time keeping the boat in order. He could see that they were struggling to paddle and row their way across shore. So Jesus sat there and he laughed for a minute and he thought, I guess they probably could use my help. Wonder what I should do here. I could calm the storm again, but I've already done that. That wouldn't be very fun. I could just blow really hard and have a big gust of wind, just kind of push them the rest of the way across. Nah, that might freak them out a little bit. I could just walk to them. Never done that before. And so we did. He just walked along the water. And with the moon shining off the light, reflecting off of the glass sea, the disciples struggling against the wind and the waves. One of them looked up and saw a shadowy figure moving across the waves. They began to panic. They began to scream, it's a ghost. There's a ghost coming. There's a ghost coming towards us. They all began to scream. One of them jumped overboard and began swimming for shore, and Jesus kind of stop. It's me. It's me. Where's your guys' faith? Jesus got in the boat with them, helped them get the rest of the way to shore. There was something different about him that night. He didn't say much at dinner. He didn't eat much for breakfast the next morning. I heard him whispering with my mom and some of the other disciples in the kitchen after breakfast when they were cleaning up. He felt like he just needed to get away for a while. And so I sat there in my room as I watched Jesus and the disciples pack up all their things. I asked him where he was going. He said he just needed to get away for a while where people didn't know him, and he was going to go. He had a friend who had a place in Tyre. So they went. They left. They went to Tyre. We didn't see or hear from him for months. One night, when we were laying under the stars, Peter said, "Did I ever tell you the story about what happened in Tyre?" And I said, "No, you guys were just gone. I haven't heard anything about what happened." He said, "Well, it was a pretty uneventful time. Jesus was just kind of resting, relaxing, catching up on sleep. But one day we were sitting there. Jesus was sitting on the couch reading the morning paper when all of a sudden there was a knock at the door. Now, I thought maybe someone had ordered a pizza or something like that, but it was a little early in the morning. So I went to the door, and there was a woman standing there. And she had this look of panic on her face. And she said, "Is the rabbi here?" Well, nobody knew that we were in town, so I didn't know how she got the address and knew that Jesus was even here. But I said to her, no. You know what? He's here, but he's busy right now. He's not seeing anybody. And I slammed the door in her face. Jesus kind of looked down over his paper and said, "Who was that, Peter?" And Peter said, "It was just some woman looking for you." And Jesus kind of flipped the paper back up and went back to his reading. A few minutes later, another knock on the door. Well, Peter goes back to the door and he opens the door and it's the woman again. He says, "Look, I told you that Jesus can't help you right now," and shut the door back in her face. Well, the woman was relentless. And so she went around the house, found an open window that looked into the living room, and crawled up on the window, poked her head through, and shouted at Jesus, "Jesus, please, just give me a minute. My little girl's back home. I've come a long ways, and she's possessed by a demon. And can you please do something? Now, Peter says that Jesus looked at the woman. He said, "Woman, I'm on vacation. Leave me alone. I don't have time for you dogs." Peter said everyone in the room stopped and looked at Jesus. They knew he was tired, but they didn't know he was that tired. But the woman, did I say she was relentless? She looked right back at him and said, "Yeah, you're right. But even dogs eat the scraps off of the master's table." Jesus set his newspaper down. Little smile crept up on his face. He said, "Woman, great comeback. Your daughter's fine. You can go home now." Yeah. When they came back into town, they were greeted by a group of friends who had brought a man to him who was deaf since the moment he was born and unable to speak. Deaf and unable to speak. 3 friends that had brought him to Jesus and said, "Jesus, this is our friend. We've known him all our lives, and he's deaf and unable to speak. And, well, we've heard about the things that you can do." Jesus looked at the man. And it was as if he could look into people's souls. He could see right into their eyes and feel all of their emotions. And he knew immediately with this man what he was feeling. You see, you don't know what it's like to be deaf and unable to speak. To have an ailment that no one else can see, that no one else can feel. You see, when you're blind, it's easy, because when you're blind, everyone knows that you're blind. When you're blind, you have the glasses. When you're blind, you have the stick walking around. Everyone knows when you're blind. But when you're deaf and unable to hear, mute and unable to speak, you live your life being made a spectacle. You live your life walking down the street, stepping out into traffic, unaware of the oncoming horses and buggies and on their way. You can't hear the screams of the people telling you to watch out, to step back, until someone grabs you, pulls you back, and you look, and the entire street is staring at you. This man had lived his entire life in front of the crowd. Man had lived his entire existence being made a spectacle. And when Jesus looked into this man's eyes, he could see that he no longer wanted to be made a spectacle in front of the crowd. And so Jesus put his arm around the man's shoulder, and he walked with him. He walked with him out behind the dumpster in the middle of the alleyway. He took the man down to where no one else could see. I know that you don't use these. So let me speak to you here. And I know that you don't speak with this. So let me touch you here. And the first words that this man heard in his entire existence, "Epaphatha, be open." And suddenly his body shook. He jolted as the sounds came flooding in from all around. Sounds that he'd often wondered what they made, but never quite knew. The sounds of the birds, the sounds of the rustling of the leaves, and the sounds of his friends, as they could see that something had just happened down the alleyway. Epaphatha, be open. Another day, Jesus was walking down the road when a blind man came up to him. A blind man with his glasses and a blind man with his stick. He was an elderly gentleman. He came in, he said, "Rabbi, would you heal me?" Well, Jesus at this point, you could tell that there was something going on with him. Ever since he'd come back from Tyre, there was something different about him. He was a little more quiet. He was a little bit more somber. He didn't have quite the pep in his step. The disciples would say that most nights when they were out on the road, he didn't talk much as they went to sleep. And I know that the nights that he was in our house, the conversations didn't stretch on into the morning like they used to. There was definitely something weighing on the rabbi. There was something going on inside his head and inside his heart. And when the blind man came to him and said, Rabbi, heal me, Jesus took him aside and he spit in the ground. He put the mud together and he put it on the blind man's eyes. The blind man wiped it away and Jesus said, can you see now? The man opened his eyes, blinked a little bit, wiped away a little bit more mud. Jesus, I can see. Don't get me wrong, it's better than it was, but everything looks like trees. Jesus looked a little confused. He reached down and got a little bit more mud, put it on him again, wiped it away. Now what? The man blinked, looked. Oh yeah, I can see now. Everything's clear. Everything's great. Everything's fine. Thank you, Rabbi. And the man picked up his stuff and he ran away. Jesus walked out to the disciples and began to say, why didn't it work the first time? Jesus, what's going on? You've never had a partial miracle before. Jesus, what's happening here? Talk to me. Jesus wouldn't say a word. They simply went and they laid down and he said, let's just go to sleep. I'm really tired. Woke up the next morning before the sun. They packed up their camp and they began to make their way. The disciples said, where are we going? Jesus said, we're heading to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi. It was the greatest city. It was the greatest city in all of the world. It was a place where everywhere you looked, there was everything that you could want. Great, great cliffs with marble monuments to the gods all around you. Streams that led to the sea. Great palaces, great casinos, great churches, the best of the best of the best of everything that man had to offer. Anything that you could want that man had to offer was available to you in Caesarea Philippi. Everywhere you looked, everywhere that you could see on the road as the disciples in the crowd were following him, was the best of everything that you could want. All of your hopes, all of your dreams, all of your desires could be filled in Caesarea Philippi. And standing on the road, Jesus stops. And the disciples and the hundreds of people that had left everything and were following him at this point stopped with him. Jesus turns around and he says, this is Caesarea Philippi. Anything you want is available in this city. All the best of what man has to offer, readily available at your fingertips. And so amongst all of this, amongst all of these great gods that we see their statues, amongst all of these great kingdoms that we see their kings represented, amongst all of the best of nature, all of the best of man, all of the best of architecture, who do people say that I am? Well, the people were excited to answer this one. As people begin to shout, well, some say you're Elijah. Some say you're Moses. Some say you're a prophet. Some say you're a great teacher. Jesus stopped him. No. Who do you say that I am? Who am I to you? No one wanted to answer that question until finally Peter stepped out from the crowd. It was always Peter. He stepped out from the crowd and he said, I'll tell you who you are. You're the one who we've been waiting for 2,400 years. You're the one that my father told me would come. You're the one that my grandfather told me stories about. You're the one who my great-great-grandfather would read to me bedtime stories about. You're the Messiah. You're the Redeemer. You're the Christ. You're the Savior of our people who's going to come and restore us back to our places of world power. You are the one that we've been waiting for. You are the Son of God. You are the Christ. You could have cut the tension with a knife. Every eye stood on Jesus. How would he answer the claim that Peter had just made? Jesus smiled. He said, yeah, Peter, I'm exactly who you say that I am. Now, let me tell you what that means. Because you see, in just a few days, I'm going to be captured. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be mocked. I'm going to be killed. Not only killed, I'm going to be crucified. Peter shut him up right there and he said, Rabbi, no, you need to be quiet. Rabbi, you need to stop because you see all these people? You see, all these hundreds of people that are here following you, they've been following you hoping that you were the one. They've been following you thinking that maybe you were the one. And now you've just said you were the one. Jesus, and now you say that you're the one, but you say that you're going to die. No, that's not what the comic book said. That's not what the fairy tale book said was going to happen. You're the Messiah. You're the one. We're all behind you on this. Doesn't have to go down like this. It can go down a different way. You see, you've got a pretty good following here. A lot of people like you. We've got swords. We can do this. We can set you up as a power. We can overthrow Rome. We can recapture our place. The nation of Israel can be reborn as a prominent world power. We can do this, Jesus. Jesus cut him off. He looked Peter straight in the eye. He got right in his face. He pointed his finger in his chest. He said, "You back away from me, Satan." Because if you haven't noticed, I've got a little bit of tension going on inside of me right now. In case you haven't noticed, the past few days I've been a little bit more quiet than usual. In case you haven't noticed, I'm not sleeping very well at night. It's because the things that are about to happen to me, I don't want to happen. You think I want to die? You think I want to be tortured? You think I want to be mocked? You think I want to be crucified? I don't want to do this. But if I'm going to go through with this, then I need you, Peter, especially you, not to be the voice of Satan whispering in my ear that it can be done a different way. Because this is the only way that it can be done. This is how it has to be done. In fact, all of you, let me tell you, you've been following me, hoping that I was the one. Hoping that I was the one that would come back and restore your great name to power. Well, let me tell you what it means to follow me. If you really want to follow me, then you have to die to yourself. You have to pick up your cross right alongside of me. You have to give up all of your hopes, all of your dreams for self. You have to die to yourself. Pick up your cross and follow me. And if any of you can't do that, if that's not what you signed up for, then get out now while you still can. Several people went home that day. We left the city of Caesarea Philippi, found a place to camp. Jesus grabbed Peter, James, and John, and he said, "Would you guys come with me for a few minutes? I need to go do something." They went up onto a mountain. Jesus walked up ahead of them where Peter says that when they got up there, the most miraculous thing that he'd ever seen in his life took place. Jesus was up on the mountain praying, and then all of a sudden, standing next to him was Moses and Elijah. Not just figures of them, but Moses and Elijah standing on the mountain next to Jesus. And said Jesus turned from his normal clothes into something when Peter was telling me the story at night, and I was like, "How do you want me to describe this? How do you want me to write this down?" Peter just said, you just need to say that it was what's the word? What's the word that I'm looking for? He was dazzling. Dazzling? He was dazzling. He was like whiter than you could bleach. He was unbleachably, okay, let me get this straight. He was dazzling, unbleachably white. Yeah, that's what he was. All right, Peter. Dazzling, unbleachably white. So Jesus stood there, dazzling and unbleachably white. And Peter ran up to him and he said, "Mo, Eli, so glad that you're here. Man, I've got your guys' trading cards. Can I get an autograph? In fact, are you guys staying for dinner? Because I've got some food back here that I've got on the fire." And I didn't plan. I only planned for 4, not for 6. But we can share. I won't eat. I won't even. You guys? You can have my tent. Are you guys staying? Peter said all of a sudden they were gone. Moses and Eli were just gone. Then that voice from before, at the beginning of the story, it came back. This time it said as a light shone solely on Jesus. And it said, "Again, this is my son, and you are to listen to him and him only." And then it was gone. The rest of the disciples began elbowing Peter, saying, "Way to go, you sure blew that one." As they walked back down the mountain, they saw a ruckus happening down in the camp below. They walked down, and Jesus walked up and saw a man with his boy sitting there as the disciples and some of the religious leaders had come in were arguing. Jesus walked up and said, What's going on here? What's happening?" The man grabbed his boy by the hand and walked up to Jesus and said, "Jesus, this is my son. He's been possessed by demons since the moment he was a little boy. It's just me and him. He's all that I've got in this world. And I thought that maybe your disciples could heal him, but they weren't able to do anything for him. Jesus said, bring the boy to me. He brought the boy. He said, how long has he been like this? The father said he's been like this since birth. His mom died in giving birth to him, and he's been like this ever since. Jesus, it's ruined our lives. He's my only son. He's everything that I got, and I can't do anything with him. I can't take him camping because every time I try to take him camping, the demon throws him into the fire and tries to burn him. I haven't been able to take my boy fishing because every time we set up our line and reel and we toss it in, the demon throws him into the river and tries to drown him. He can't play soccer with his friends. He loves to play soccer. He has a ball and he tries to go out into the streets and play soccer with the neighborhood kids, and they won't play with him because no one wants to play soccer with a demon-possessed boy. And Jesus, I've tried everything, and I just thought maybe if you could, and Jesus cut him off. He said, if I can? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Have you been reading the headlines? Do you see the 12-year-old girl? Do you hear about the storm? Do you hear about the people that I fed? If I can do anything, anything's possible for those who believe. The father looked at Jesus and he said, Oh, Rabbi, I believe. Please help my unbelief. Jesus took the boy by the hands. Immediately he began to convulse and fall down to the ground. His eyes rolled back in the back of his head, and then the shaking and the quivering stopped. The boy opened his eyes. He looked up at his father and he saw all the faces staring at him. He said, Daddy, what happened? Did it happen again? Daddy, what's going on? The father reached down, picked his son up into his arms. He said, Son, it's okay. I brought you to see a man. And I think that everything's going to be okay now. Let's go home. And as they hand in hand were walking out of the camp, the young boy looked up at his father and said, Daddy, it's today a day that maybe we can try to go fishing again. And the father looked at his son and said, Son, I have a feeling from now on every day is a day that we can go fishing. And as soon as we get home, let's pack up our stuff and I'm going to take you camping. It's just the way he was. He loved kids. He loved people. They came back into town. It was the time for Passover, and the biggest holiday of holidays. It was a time when our city, Jerusalem, grew from a population of about 300,000 for every other week of the year to 3.5, maybe 4.5 million people came into town for Passover. It was a celebration. If you wanted to get a reservation at a hotel, you needed to make it a year in advance. If you wanted a place to go to dinner, you better have had a reservation months in advance. It was Passover time, and everyone was there. But this year, there was a little bit different buzz because everyone knew what had been happening with Jesus. For the last 3.5 years, the world had been filled with the stories of this man who seemed to be fulfilling every prophecy that our fathers had told us about this Redeemer who was going to come. You see, for the last 2,440 years, our people had lived under oppression. First from the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Syrians, the Persians, and now we've been living under Roman oppression. Waiting on the promised hope of this Messiah who would come and would restore us back to power. And this Jesus, rumor was that he might be the one. And so when he came walking into town, there was a buzz. People lined the streets. People began waving palm branches and throwing coats out. They began shouting. One man started, Hosanna! Save us now. And that set the crowd off. Everyone began chanting, Hosanna, Hosanna, save us now, save us now, save us now. One person stood up on a chair, said, great is the coming kingdom of David. Everyone cheered. King David, the last time our people had any kind of power and prestige in the world. Oh, the coming kingdom of David. He was going to do it. This Jesus was going to lead a rebellion. Hosanna, save now. The people went crazy. Jesus walked through town, through the parade of people. He walked up to the temple. He flung open the doors. He stared at the religious leaders who were leading. Didn't say a word. It was just simply to announce his presence that he'd arrived. And he turned and walked back away. The next 3 days, Jesus would spend in the temple teaching. The religious leaders would come and one after another try to trap him in something to turn public opinion against him. They asked him where he got his authority from. They asked him questions about taxes. They asked him questions about if a woman was married to a brother who died and married the brother and married the brother and married the brother, and they got to heaven and there were 7 brothers who had all been married to, who would be his? Every time Jesus shot them down and left them looking embarrassed and foolish in front of all the people that they were trying to impress. One asked him what the greatest commandment was of all the commandments, of all that the Bible was full of. Jesus answered all of them with remarkable poise and left them scrambling, trying to find a way to get rid of him. The day before the Passover feast, we were all reclining in my house when Mary came in. She had her jar with her. It was her jar of oil, her jar of perfume. Now, this was a family heirloom. It had been in her family for generations. It was worth about a year's wages. This was some of the most valuable, expensive perfume that she had, and she came over and she asked if it would be okay for her to anoint Jesus with it. Well, it was customary to do so, and so everyone thought that she would just simply drop a few drops of the oil on Jesus' head, but no. She took that thing, she cracked it open, and she poured it all over him. Well, Judas, who was the money keeper, began to flip out on her. Mary, how could you do that? That was such a waste. Don't you know what that money could have gone for? That could have funded our whole ministry. Do you know how many sick people we could have healed with that? Do you know how many hungry people we could have fed? Do you know how many cold people we could have put clothes on? How many homeless people we could have housed? Mary, what a waste. And Jesus stood up and he said, Judas, you be quiet. The poor you will have with you always, but me you will only have for a short time. What she has just done is a beautiful thing. So Judas, you need to leave her alone. Judas looked absolutely stunned. He got up and stormed out of that place as fast as he could. He walked through the night and he went up to the temple, the place where the religious leaders were sitting, plotting on how to get rid of Jesus. He went up to the door where he knew they would all be and he knocked on the door. I can tell you exactly where he'll be. And I can tell you exactly how to get him. Are you in or are you out? Aren't you Judas? Aren't you one of his disciples? Yeah. And he embarrassed me for the last time tonight. I was simply just trying to be responsible with the money like he'd asked me to do. I was simply just trying to carry things on, and he said that this woman had done a beautiful thing by wasting all of that money. He embarrassed me in front of all of my friends. He called me out in front of everyone, and I'm sick of it. It's clear that he's not going to lead the rebellion that we all want him to, and so I'm telling you right now, I can tell you exactly where he'll be. I can tell you exactly how to get him. Are you in or are you out? Okay. Then meet me here tonight, and I'll take you to him. Judas went back to the house where Jesus and the rest of the disciples were preparing for the Passover meal. It's the same meal that everyone had done for the last 2,000 years. The exact same things had been said every time for the last 2,000 years. The final cup, the cup that represented the promised Messiah, Jesus picked it up. And instead of saying the words that had been spoken in every Jewish household for the last 2 millennia, he said, this cup, this cup that we're about to drink, this is my blood. And guys, I know that you don't understand it right now, but you will really soon. This is my blood that is going to be poured out for you so that your blood won't need to be poured out. And every time that you drink of this, guys, would you remember me? He then grabbed a piece of bread. He said, in this bread, this symbolizes my body that's broken for you, and I know that you don't understand it right now. But every time that you eat of this, would you remember me? Not much was said the rest of the meal. Jesus got up and he walked out to the Garden of Gethsemane. He asked the disciples to come with him. He did this most nights when he was here. I snuck out of bed and followed him out. I knew exactly where he would go, and so I had a little place where I'd often go and sit and watch him in the garden. But this night was different. As I watched him from the bushes, he sat on the ground and he just cried out to God, God, there's got to be another way. God, I don't want to do this. God, I don't want to do this. God, I don't want to do this. You could hear a sound of feet coming up the cobblestone. You could hear the sound of swords clanging, metal clanging on shields. And Jesus stood, he went to the disciples who were asleep, and he woke them, and he said, my captors are here, let's go meet them. From my space in the bushes, I could see the lights beginning to make their way up the walkway. I looked, and at the front of the line was Judas. He walked right up. Rabbi? Judas? The next 24 hours are kind of a blur. They captured Jesus. They took him. They put him on trial for no crime, and yet found him guilty and punishable by death. They beat him. They mocked him. They crucified him. And when he breathed his last breath and cried out, it was finished, the entire earth mourned. The sky turned dark, the veil ripped, and the entire earth stood still. I went back to my room. I laid in my bed and I cried. I cried through Friday and Saturday and most of Sunday. My mom came and woke me up early Sunday morning and said, we're going to take care of the body to pay it our last respects. Do you want to come with us? I said, no, I can't go. My mom said as they were walking down the path, they were talking about making sure they had everything that they needed. They got to the tomb and the stone wasn't there. They walked inside fearful that someone had come in the night and stolen the body, and they said there was a man dressed in a white robe sitting there eating sunflower seeds. He said, you're looking for Jesus, so he's not here. Why don't you head on back into town? He'll meet you there. He's risen. Well, my mom came running back into town, not quite knowing what to believe. She spent the rest of her life trying to tell the story to anyone who would listen about this rabbi named Jesus. He was born in a stable in an obscure village. From there, he traveled less than 200 miles in his entire life. He never won an election. He never went to college. He never owned a home. He never had a lot of money. He was betrayed by his closest friend, and his other friends ran away. 19 centuries have come and gone from the time that I wrote that story. Empires have risen and empires have fallen. Mighty armies have marched and powerful rulers have reigned, yet no one has affected the course of history as much as he has. He's the central figure of the human race. He is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is Jesus Christ, the image of the unseen God and the firstborn of all creation. For in him were created all things in heaven and on earth. One last thing. I didn't put this in the story. It's a little bit too personal, but I'll share it with you. That night in the garden, as I was staring at him through the bushes, he knew I was there. He always knew I was there, I think. But that night, as he heard the sounds of the army walking up the cobblestone, as he finished his last plea with his father, as he stood up to go and face his accusers and his captors, he looked at me in those bushes and he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, Mark, I'm doing this for you.